this separation of children from their parents in this way, why would we expect that it would have any different results from other ways that we say are having problematic consequences?
I was looking at a popular Instagram account recently, and it was of this couple, lesbian couple, living married, as saying we're married, and they have these 2 children, and they talk openly about how the donor, not the father, these children have no father to them, it's a donor. They use the same donor, so the children look similar, and one of the mother's, eggs, and she carried the children, so some through IVF. And they intentionally had one boy, one girl, and they have, they publicize their whole life, potty training their boy. You see him on the toilet. I mean, they really have everything there as part of their journey of being a gay couple, is what they call this account. But I just remember thinking and looking just even at some of the comments, everyone just praising them, praising the beauty of their family. It's so interesting that the donor, they say, we don't talk about the donor a lot, and I just think about this boy they're raising, that they intentionally brought into existence, who has a father. They're not acknowledging him as a father of any kind. He's just simply a donor. And there's 0 father in his life. There's no father in his life. And when all the data says that fatherlessness is one of the leading causes, arguably the leading cause of any number of social ills that a person can experience.
And boys experiencing it in a more difficult way.
Criminality, addiction, mental health, economic opportunity. I mean, in every category, not having a father, especially like you said, as a boy, is devastating. So how did we get to the point where we're accepting and even celebrating online these social experiments that we're performing on children?
I think there's 2 things. One is we really are a pretty materialist, individualist country. And that has a lot of, you go girl, and social mobility is great advantages, but it also has disadvantages. And if we moved at a little slower pace, lived at a little lesser income, spent more time on family things than individual self-maximization and money, the United States would be a different place, but a more familial place. Secondarily, I think that there's always been a tendency, really beginning in the 60s, no-fault divorce was the beginning of that conversation writ large about adults first, and as long as the adults are happy, the children will be happy, which did not prove out. But one of the papers I wrote, I think it was in the Stanford Journal of Law and Public Policy. It was one of my early law review articles. I went back and I read every page of the transcript of the first debate at the National Commission on Uniform Laws over whether or not to invent no-fault divorce. And I read every page. And through it, there's this one guy in particular. It's an African-American delegate from D.C. And he keeps going, hey, we've been noticing that the boys in our schools without fathers are struggling more. And at that point, remember, D.C. was like 70-80% African-American, right? He says, I'm not so sure we should be moving so fast on this. They say, oh, excellent point. We will look at it. That's in like year 1. Year 3 is like, excuse me, I don't really think this has been brought into the conversation. And they're like, excellent point. We'll look at it. Finally, right before the closing bell, he says it again. And they're like, we looked at it. Everything's fine. They never looked at it. Don Browning, who is I think a sociologist and theologian at UChicago, used to say, we put adults at the front door. And then at the back door, we go, okay, the children aren't doing so well, but here's how we're going to make it up to you. And my book on putting children's interests first, I have an entire chapter on how we're trying to make it up to children at the back door and what works and what doesn't. And they're recovery efforts. They're not setting up a strong foundation. And recovery is always harder.
And more expensive. Yes. So what is your take on no-fault divorce? It's very controversial.
Complex.
Especially among conservatives. A lot of conservatives today increasingly are saying it's ridiculous. No-fault divorce is the reason we got to our sky-high divorce rates and our single parenthood rates. And then there's this other voice over here that says, well, what about abuse and those tricky cases where it's hard to prove abuse? So what do? I got in a lot of hate recently on a podcast saying, well, I won't be so quick to wholeheartedly condemn no-fault divorce. I think it depends what you mean by no-fault divorce. Right. I don't think divorce for any reason is acceptable. Of course not. I don't think we should be promoting it. But there's a lot of complexities there. So what's your
Yes.
take on that, Helen?
So I have researched and teach a lot about this. First thing to say is divorce rates were already rising before no-fault divorce came in, right? And how do they do that? Collusion. You hire your lawyer secretary to be the woman in the room when you show up and go, you're in adultery. No, there was a lot of mutual consent. Really, you call it conniving in advance to say, yeah, there was desertion, there was cruelty, when there wasn't.
Between the spouses.
Yes.
They
wanted a divorce. Okay. So the idea that no fault created the huge numbers we have, it was both a release valve for the already existing increase, and it seriously eroded the seriousness of the marital commitment. It's both and, okay? That said, a couple of things. Once no-fault divorce took hold everywhere, fault did not leave the divorce equation entirely. Sometimes states would allow it in the property distribution calculus. Sometimes they'd allow it in the spousal support. It used to be called alimony. Now it's like maintenance.
Or custody,
support.
right?
Sometimes in custody. Then it started to leave those arenas, and it just didn't count for anything. So what to do? I would like to say I would rather have fault divorce without collusion.
What does that look like?
That's a hard one because there's so much divorce that courts don't have time to look into it all the time. So what's a next best? A next best is, all right, honey, maybe it's not in the divorce, but it's going to cost you in these other arenas if there is fault. So you put fault back in as part of the calculus for property distribution or one of the...
So you're allowed to divorce. It's just going to cost you.
It's going to cost you if there's fault.
It's expensive.
Or we're always going to look and say, who really wants out? Because that's not good for the kids, and you know it. And it's going to cost you in custody. And one of the things you find in the debate over custody is this sort of shame that went out of, oh my gosh, I'm having a divorce, has entered into the custodial determination arena. People are like, what do you mean you don't think I'm deserving of custody? Not being a decent parent is actually still a sin in the secular vernacular.
Thank goodness.
Being a bad spouse, it's like, a dime a dozen bad spouses. Didn't work out. We weren't happy. Everybody understands. They don't understand if you're not deemed to be a good parent.